Welcome back to Tell Me More Stories Told as Podcast. We dive into the stories that shaped our world, and today we're going deep into a story of ambition.
Deception.
Oh yeah, and a corporate downfall so massive, it sparked sweeping changes across the financial landscape.
Got it, yeah. We're talking about the Enron scandal. The story of an energy giant that went from Wall Street darling to bankrupt practically overnight. It's a story that reminds us even the most successful companies can be built on lies.
Yeah, and get this, at its peak, Enron was valued at over $60 billion. That's billion with a B.
Wow.
To put that in perspective, that's like the entire GDP of some countries.
It really is incredible how Enron managed to fool everyone for so long. Investors, analysts, even their own board of directors, they were masters of illusion, using incredibly complex financial instruments to hide billions of dollars in debt.
Okay, so before we get into their downfall, let's rewind a bit. How did Enron rise to such incredible heights in the first place? They weren't always this massive corporation, right?
No, not at all. Enron's story actually began pretty modestly back in 1985. It started as a merger between two natural gas pipeline companies,
Okay.
Houston Natural Gas and Inter North.
So two companies joining forces.
Exactly, joining forces to become a bigger player in the natural gas industry.
Gotcha.
And leading this newly formed Enron was Kenneth Lay, a man with a vision for the company's future.
So he's the CEO.
He was. And Lay saw a huge opportunity in the deregulation of energy markets, a trend that was gaining momentum in the early 1990s.
Deregulation. I have a feeling that's a pretty significant turning point in our story.
It is. Deregulation basically removed government control over energy prices.
So they could charge whatever they wanted.
Well, not exactly, but it created a more competitive free market environment. Companies like Enron could buy and sell energy at market rate.
So basically they were free to play the energy market like a high-stakes poker game.
That's a great analogy. And under Lay's leadership, Enron jumped headfirst into this deregulated world. They weren't content with just pipelines anymore. They aggressively diversified, expanding into electricity, broadband, even international markets.
So they were spreading their wings trying to become a global energy powerhouse.
Exactly. And for a while, this strategy seemed to be pure genius. Enron's revenues were skyrocketing. Their stock price was soaring. They were hailed as one of the most innovative companies in America.
The epitome of the go-go 90s.
Exactly. A time of booming markets and seemingly limitless growth.
But as we know, all that glitters is not gold. What was lurking beneath this shiny surface of success?
Beneath that facade, a much darker story was unfolding. Enron's success wasn't built on genuine innovation or sound business practices. It was built on accounting tricks, manipulation, and outright deception.
Okay, let's break down these accounting practices. What were they doing to create this illusion of success?
Well, one of their main tools was mark-to-market accounting.
Okay.
This is where you estimate the future value of an asset or contract and then record that estimated profit as current income.
So they were basically saying, we're going to make a ton of money in the future, so let's just record those profits now.
Pretty much. And while mark-to-market accounting can be legitimate in some cases, Enron abused it to inflate their earnings and create a picture of consistent growth, even when their actual operations were struggling. Imagine buying a lottery ticket and immediately claiming the jackpot as income, even though you haven't won anything yet.
Talk about risky business. But mark-to-market accounting wasn't their only trick, right? They had other ways of hiding their financial troubles.
They did. Enron created a web of incredibly complex financial instruments and off-balance sheet entities. These were basically shell companies designed to keep their risky ventures and mounting debts hidden from investors and regulators.
So it's like stuffing all your dirty laundry under the bed, hoping no one will notice the growing pile.
Precisely. And these off-balance sheet entities were incredibly opaque. Even experienced analysts had trouble deciphering what Enron was really up to. They gave these entities bizarre names like Chuco, White Wing, and even raptors named after the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park.
Raptors. That's a bit ominous considering what happened to those dinosaurs in the movie, right?
Yeah, right. And these special purpose entities played a key role in Enron's elaborate scheme. They allowed the company to maintain this illusion of financial health while masking their true precarious position.
So we have mark-to-market accounting and these shadowy off-balance sheet entities. How did they get away with this for so long? Were there no warning signs?
Believe it or not, there were. Analysts and journalists had been raising concerns about Enron's opaque accounting practices for years. And even within Enron, there were a few brave souls who tried to sound the alarm.
Like whistleblowers, people trying to expose the truth.
Exactly. One of those whistleblowers was Sharon Watkins, an Enron vice president. She famously wrote a memo to Ken Lay, warning him that the company was built on a house of cards and that the whole thing could come crashing down if anyone took a closer look.
A house of cards. That's a pretty accurate analogy considering what eventually happened. So what did Lay do with this warning? Did he heed her advice?
Unfortunately, no. Lay initially promised to investigate Watkins' concerns. But instead of bringing in an independent auditor, he hired the very same law firm that had been advising Enron on its accounting practices.
That doesn't sound very impartial.
It wasn't. And that firm, Vincent and Elkins, unsurprisingly gave Enron a clean bill of health.
Well, that doesn't sound very impartial. It seems like Lay was more interested in protecting Enron's image than actually addressing the problems.
You're right. And it was a huge missed opportunity to course correct before things spiraled out of control. It's a perfect example of how a culture of secrecy and denial can lead to disaster.
Before we hear more about how this all unraveled, I just want to remind everyone to hit that subscribe button. This is just the tip of the iceberg, and you won't want to miss the rest of this deep dive into the Enron saga right here on Tell Me More Stories Told as a Podcast.
It's a cautionary tale about corporate greed, unchecked ambition, and the devastating consequences that can follow. A story with lessons that are still relevant in today's business world.
So let's get back to Enron. The house of cards was starting to wobble. What were the events that finally brought the whole thing crashing down?
Well, remember those concerns that analysts and journalists had been raising about Enron's accounting practices?
Yeah?
Those concerns started gaining more traction in the early 2000s. As Enron's stock price began to falter, the cracks were starting to show.
Like the market was sensing something wasn't quite right.
Exactly. And then in March 2001, Fortune magazine published an article that really shook things up. The article titled, "Is Enron Overpriced?" questioned how the company could justify its sky-high stock valuation given its opaque financial statements and complex business model.
So someone finally calling them out.
They were. The article was written by a journalist named Bethany McLean, and her reporting was meticulous.
This article was like shining a spotlight on all the shady dealings that Enron had been trying to keep hidden.
It was, and it caught the attention of investors and regulators alike. McLean's article highlighted those red flags that many had overlooked or dismissed, and it raised serious questions about Enron's ability to sustain its phenomenal growth. You could almost hear the alarm bells starting to ring.
I bet that caused quite a stir within Enron. Did they try to dismiss the article? Downplay its significance?
They did try, but the damage was done. The article had planted a seed of doubt in the minds of investors, and that seed began to grow. Then in August 2001, just a few months after McLean's article, Jeffrey Skilling abruptly resigned as CEO, citing personal reasons. He had only been in the top job for 6 months.
That's like the captain abandoning ship in the middle of a storm. What was the market's reaction to that?
Panic, essentially. Skilling's sudden departure sent shockwaves through the financial world. Investors were spooked, and Enron's stock price went into a freefall. It was like watching a domino effect in action.
Okay, so we have a critical article highlighting Enron's questionable practices, and then the CEO abruptly resigns. Things are definitely starting to unravel. What happens next?
Well, just a few weeks after Skilling's resignation, remember Sharon Watkins, our whistleblower?
Yeah.
She sent that anonymous memo to Kenneth Lay outlining her concerns about the company's accounting practices. She believed these practices were putting the company at tremendous risk, and she urged Lay to take action.
So Watkins was trying to warn Lay one last time before the whole house of cards collapsed.
Exactly. She was incredibly brave to speak up, knowing the potential risks involved. But unfortunately, her warnings went largely ignored. Lay chose to protect the company's image and maintain the illusion of success, even as the cracks were widening.
It's almost like he was clinging to a sinking ship, refusing to acknowledge the inevitable.
That's a good way to put it. And despite all these warning signs, Enron continued to try and maintain its facade of success, at least for a little while longer. But the pressure was mounting, and the truth was about to come out in a very dramatic way.
Welcome back to Tell Me More Stories Told as Podcast. When we left off, Enron's stock price was falling. A critical article in Fortune magazine had raised questions, and the CEO had made a sudden exit.
Yeah, the cracks in Enron's facade were starting to show. It was only a matter of time before the whole house of cards came tumbling down.
So what was the final nail in the coffin for Enron? What truly exposed the extent of their deception?
Well, all those warnings from Sharon Watkins about Enron's accounting practices, along with the mounting pressure from investors, and the media eventually forced their hands.
So they could no longer sweep their problems under the rug.
No, they couldn't. In October 2001, Enron was forced to announce a massive restatement of their earnings. They had to admit that they had been inflating their profits and hiding their losses all along.
Wow, that's a pretty big bombshell to drop.
Yeah.
What was the market's reaction?
It was chaos. The restatement wiped out over $600 million in previously reported earnings, and it revealed that Enron's debt was far greater than anyone had realized. Their stock price went into a complete freefall. Investors were panicking, and their creditors were starting to get very nervous.
So the jig was up. Enron's web of deception had finally been exposed. What did they do next?
While facing a liquidity crisis and the prospect of bankruptcy, Enron went into damage control mode. They desperately needed a lifeline.
So they were scrambling to find a way out of this mess.
Yeah, they were. And in a move that surprised many, they turned to their biggest rival, Carnegie,
Diniga.
another major player in the energy trading business. Enron proposed a merger, hoping that Carnegie would be willing to acquire them and rescue them from financial ruin.
That's like asking your arch nemesis for a favor. Did Carnegie seriously consider this offer?
Initially, they did. They saw an opportunity to acquire Enron's assets at a fire sale price and become the dominant force in the energy market. It was a calculated risk, but one they were willing to take, at least at first.
So there was a glimmer of hope for Enron, a chance they could be saved.
For a brief moment, it seemed that way. In November 2001, Carnegie agreed to acquire Enron for a reported $8 billion in stock.
Wow.
It looked like Enron might pull off a miracle escape.
But I have a feeling there's a twist coming. It couldn't have been that easy.
Right. You're right. The deal was contingent on Carnegie conducting a due diligence review of Enron's financial records. Essentially, they wanted to look under the hood before signing on the dotted line.
So Carnegie wanted to make sure they weren't inheriting a financial time bomb.
Exactly. And as Carnegie's accountants and lawyers started digging deeper, they uncovered the true extent of the problems. The debt was even larger than Enron had disclosed, and the accounting practices were even more deceptive than they had imagined.
So the more they looked, the worse it got.
Exactly. And in a dramatic turn of events, Carnegie pulled out of the deal. They just couldn't stomach the risk. The potential liabilities were too great.
That must have been the final blow for Enron. No white knight, no rescue mission. What happened next?
With Carnegie out of the picture, Enron had nowhere left to turn. They were drowning in debt. Their stock was practically worthless, and their reputation was in tatters. The game was over.
So this was the end of the line for Enron.
It was on December 2, 2001, just a month after the Carnegie deal collapsed. Enron filed for bankruptcy. It was the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history at the time. A truly stunning fall from grace for a company that was once a Wall Street darling.
It's hard to believe that a company valued at billions of dollars could implode so quickly. What were the immediate consequences of this collapse? Who were the biggest victims?
Well, the most immediate consequences were felt by Enron's employees. Thousands of people lost their jobs, their retirement savings, and their livelihoods practically overnight.
That's devastating.
Yeah.
They were caught in the crossfire of this corporate greed.
They were. Many employees had invested heavily in the company's stock, believing in its success. But when the company went bankrupt, their retirement accounts, which were heavily weighted with Enron stock, were wiped out. They lost everything.
Now, they lost their jobs and their savings. That's awful.
It was. And it wasn't just Enron's employees who suffered. Investors, both large and small, lost billions of dollars as Enron's stock price plummeted. Pension funds, mutual funds, and other institutional investors also took a major hit. The Enron scandal shook investor confidence and exposed the vulnerabilities of a system that relied too heavily on self-regulation and opaque accounting practices.
So it was a systemic failure with consequences that extended far beyond Enron itself.
Absolutely. The Enron scandal was a wake-up call for the entire business world. It forced regulators, investors, and corporate leaders to take a hard look at the system.
So what happened next? Did anything positive come out of this disaster?
Well, in the aftermath of the Enron scandal, there was a widespread call for reform. And while it's impossible to completely eliminate corporate greed and deception, there were some significant changes made to try and prevent another Enron.
What kind of changes are we talking about?
One of the most significant was the passage of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. This act, often referred to as SOX, introduced reforms aimed at strengthening corporate governance, improving financial reporting, and restoring investor trust.
So it was a direct response to the Enron scandal.
It was SOX imposed stricter accounting rules, increased auditor independence, and enhanced corporate responsibility for financial reporting. It was a landmark piece of legislation that significantly reshaped the corporate landscape.
So Enron's legacy, while tarnished by scandal and deceit, also includes a push for greater transparency and accountability in the corporate world.
That's right. The Enron scandal serves as a constant reminder that even the most successful companies can be brought down by a lack of integrity and a willingness to cut corners. It's a reminder that we need robust regulations and vigilant oversight to ensure the integrity of our financial markets.
So what happened to the key players involved in this whole mess? Did anyone face consequences for their actions? We'll find out when we return for the final part of our deep dive into the Enron scandal right here on Tell Me More Stories Told As podcast. Welcome back to Tell Me More Stories Told As podcast. We've been digging deep into the Enron scandal, a story of ambition, greed, and the consequences that come when ethical lines are crossed.
Yeah, we saw how their rise was fueled by deception and how their house of cards collapsed, leaving countless victims.
But what happened to the people who orchestrated this massive fraud? Did they face any repercussions?
Well, after Enron's collapse, the Justice Department launched a full-scale investigation.
So the feds were on the case.
Big time. It was like a legal earthquake shaking corporate America. They were determined to hold someone accountable.
So who were they going after?
Well, the investigation led to a series of high-profile trials and convictions. It was a legal drama that captivated the nation. Remember Andrew Fastow, the guy behind those off-balance sheet partnerships?
The CFO, right? The one hiding all the debts?
Yeah, Fastow. He was one of the first to plead guilty.
What kinds of charges was he facing?
Fraud, money laundering, conspiracy. He cut a deal with prosecutors, agreed to testify against his former bosses in exchange for a reduced sentence.
So he flipped.
Yep. He became the government's key witness.
And that testimony was against.
Kenneth Lay and Jeffrey Skilling, the two guys at the top of Enron.
What about Lay and Skilling? What happened to them?
Their trials were huge, some of the most closely watched corporate crime cases in history. Both of them maintained their innocence, claiming they were unaware of the accounting fraud happening.
So they were playing dumb.
Basically. But the prosecution had a ton of evidence. Emails, financial documents that painted a very different picture. The jury found both Lay and Skilling guilty on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy.
Wow. So they were held accountable.
Yes and no. Skilling was sentenced to over 24 years, although that was later reduced. Lay died of a heart attack before he could be sentenced.
So he never saw the inside of a prison cell.
No, he didn't. And while the convictions brought some closure to Enron's victims, it didn't erase the pain they'd endured. The financial and emotional scars ran deep.
We've talked about the executives, but what about Enron's auditor, Arthur Andersen? Weren't they supposed to be the gatekeepers of Enron's financial reporting, making sure everything was above board?
They were Arthur Andersen, one of the big five accounting firms at the time, got deeply entangled in the scandal. They were accused of turning a blind eye to Enron's shady accounting practices, possibly motivated by the consulting fees they were getting.
So greed played a part.
It seems so. And the Justice Department brought obstruction of justice charges against them, accused them of shredding documents related to the Enron audit.
Wow. Trying to cover their tracks.
It looks like it. And in 2002, Arthur Andersen was found guilty. The conviction was later overturned by the Supreme Court, but the damage was done.
So even though the conviction was overturned, their reputation was ruined.
Exactly. The scandal destroyed Arthur Andersen's reputation. They were effectively forced out of business. Thousands of employees lost their jobs, and the Enron case became a warning about the dangers of auditor complicity.
It's amazing how one company's collapse could have such massive consequences.
The Enron scandal was a seismic event. It exposed the vulnerabilities of the system and triggered a wave of reforms to prevent something like it from happening again.
And those reforms, like the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, are still in place today.
That's right. SOX has had a huge impact on corporate governance, financial reporting, the role of auditors. It's not perfect, but it's made it more difficult for companies to engage in those deceptive practices.
So Enron's downfall led to some much-needed changes.
It did. It's a reminder that transparency, accountability, and integrity are essential for a healthy business environment.
That's right. The Enron scandal, a story of ambition, greed, and the high cost of cutting corners. It's a story that continues to resonate and a reminder that the pursuit of profit should never come at the expense of ethical conduct. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Enron scandal. This is Tell Me More Stories Told As podcast signing off.